Sarah Matthews sits in her wheelchair at the altar, her white dress pristine against the worn church pew. The sanctuary holds 40 guests who came to witness her wedding, but the groom's chair remains empty. David fled 20 minutes ago, his best man delivering whispered excuses about not being ready for this kind of responsibility. The guests murmur among themselves, some checking their phones, others shaking their heads with barely concealed pity. Sarah's hands grip her bouquet so tightly the stems might break, her face burning with humiliation as laughter echoes from the back rows. Thunder rumbles outside as motorcycle engines roar into the church parking lot. A massive figure in leather appears in the doorway, his Hell's Angels jacket catching the dim sanctuary light. But what would drive a feared biker to interfere in a stranger's most vulnerable moment? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, Sarah Matthews had been different. She moved through the hospital corridors with purpose, her nursing shoes squeaking against polished floors as she checked on patients in the cardiac wing. Her engagement ring caught the fluorescent lights as she adjusted IV drips and monitored vital signs. The diamond, a promise of the future she and David had planned together. The silver medical bracelet hadn't existed then. Now it encircled her wrist like a shackle, the engraving T12 complete, marking the exact location where her spine had snapped during the accident. She touched it unconsciously, remembering the neurologist's clinical explanation of what those words meant: complete severing of the spinal cord at the 12th thoracic vertebra. No sensation below that point, no movement, no hope of recovery. David had been driving that rainy November evening. They were returning from dinner with his parents, discussing wedding venues and guest lists. Sarah remembered laughing at something he said about his mother's opinions on centerpieces when the truck ran the red light. The impact threw their car into a concrete barrier, and when Sarah woke up 3 days later, her world had fundamentally changed. The good news, Dr. Martinez had explained with practiced gentleness, is that your upper body strength and cognitive function are completely unaffected. You'll need to make adjustments, but many people with your injury level live full, productive lives. Full, productive lives. The phrase had echoed in Sarah's mind during months of physical therapy, learning to transfer from bed to wheelchair, relearning how to navigate a world designed for standing people. David had been supportive initially, visiting daily, bringing flowers and updates about their postponed wedding plans. But Sarah noticed changes. The way he hesitated before kissing her, how his eyes drifted when she discussed adaptive equipment for their future home, the careful distance he maintained when friends asked about their relationship status. She told herself it was adjustment. They both needed time to process this new reality. Her grandmother's voice echoed from childhood memories. Strength isn't about what happens to you, Sarah. It's about what you choose to do after. Grandma Rose had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when Sarah was 8. The irony wasn't lost on her that cars had shaped the most traumatic moments of her life. The settlement money from the trucking company had been substantial enough to buy her wheelchair, a lightweight titanium model that felt like an extension of her body after months of practice. She'd customized it with small details that reflected her personality: purple spoke guards, a cup holder David had installed, and a small pouch for the medical supplies she now carried everywhere. Sarah had fought to return to work, but the hospital administration deemed her a liability. Too many obstacles, they claimed. Patient safety concerns. She knew the real reason: discomfort with her disability, fears about insurance costs, the subtle prejudice that equated physical limitations with professional incompetence. David's proposal to move forward with their wedding had surprised her. She'd expected him to end their relationship, had prepared herself for that conversation during long nights staring at the ceiling. Instead, he'd suggested a small ceremony, something intimate and practical given their changed circumstances. His phrasing should have warned her. Changed circumstances reduced her injury to a logistical inconvenience, rather than a fundamental shift in how the world treated her. But Sarah had been grateful for his commitment, desperate to prove that her accident hadn't made her less worthy of love. The wedding preparations had been modest. Her disability benefits didn't allow for extravagance. Jenny, her best friend from nursing school, had helped coordinate details, while David seemed increasingly distant. He attended cake tastings and venue visits with the enthusiasm of someone fulfilling obligations rather than celebrating upcoming joy. Sarah's dress had been borrowed from a cousin, altered to accommodate her seated position. The simplicity suited her. She'd never been one for elaborate displays. The white roses and baby's breath in her bouquet were her own choice. Flowers that reminded her of Grandma, Rose's garden, and the strength she'd inherited from women who endured hardship with grace. Standing at the altar, sitting at the altar, she'd felt hopeful despite everything. David's absence seemed like typical groom nervousness until minutes stretched into certainty. The whispers began softly, then grew louder as guests realized something was fundamentally wrong. Now, with thunder rolling outside and her dignity hanging by threads, Sarah understood that David's commitment had been pity disguised as love. The medical bracelet felt heavier on her wrist, its engraving a reminder that some people would always see her injury before they saw her. David Henley stood in the church bathroom, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. His bow tie hung loose around his neck and sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the morning's cool temperature. The gold wedding band in his palm felt impossibly heavy, a circle of metal that suddenly represented a lifetime of responsibility he wasn't sure he could handle. "This is normal," he whispered to himself. "Everyone gets cold feet." But deep down, David knew this went beyond typical pre-wedding jitters. For 6 months, he'd been telling himself he was doing the right thing. Sarah needed him. She was vulnerable now, dependent in ways that made him feel important and necessary. Staying with her proved he was a good man, the kind of person who honored commitments even when circumstances changed. Except the weight of that responsibility had been crushing him slowly, day by day. Every time he helped her transfer from car to wheelchair, every time he watched her struggle with curbs and doorways, every time friends asked how he was handling everything, the pressure built until he could barely breathe. His best man, Trevor, knocked on the bathroom door. "Dave, you okay in there?" "It's almost time." David opened the door, his face pale. "I can't do this, Trev." Trevor studied his friend's expression with growing concern. They'd known each other since college, had been through breakups and career changes and family crises together. But he'd never seen David look this trapped. "Talk to me, man." "What's going on?" "She's going to need help with everything for the rest of her life," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Getting dressed, getting in and out of bed, maybe even—" He stopped, unable to voice his fears about their future intimate life. "David, you've had 6 months to think about this. Why are you realizing this now?" "Because I keep thinking it would get easier, that I'd adjust and everything would feel normal again. But it doesn't. Every day feels like I'm signing up to be a caregiver instead of a husband." Trevor winced at his friend's honesty. "You know how that sounds, right?" "Awful. I know it sounds awful. But I'm 28 years old, Trev. I'm supposed to be starting my career, maybe traveling, figuring out who I am. Instead, I'm researching wheelchair-accessible vacation rentals and learning about insurance coverage for medical equipment." The bathroom door opened, and another wedding guest entered, nodding politely before disappearing into a stall. David lowered his voice further. "I keep thinking about our parents asking about grandchildren. How do we even, is that even possible now? And if it is, what if something goes wrong? What if she needs more help than I can give?" Trevor had no answers for these questions. He'd liked Sarah before her accident. She was smart, funny, genuinely kind in a way that seemed rare. But he'd also watched David struggle with guilt and obligation that masqueraded as love. "So what are you going to do?" David looked at the wedding ring again, then set it on the sink's edge. I can't walk down that aisle and promise to love her for better or worse when I'm only here out of pity. She deserves better than that. Dave, there are 40 people out there. Sarah's in her dress waiting for you. You can't just... I know how this looks. I know I'm a coward. But wouldn't it be worse to marry her and resent her for the rest of our lives? To stay out of guilt and make both of us miserable? Trevor wanted to argue, but David's logic held uncomfortable truth. Marriages built on obligation rarely survived, and Sarah would eventually recognize the difference between love and duty. How are you going to tell her? I can't face her. I can't look at her and explain that I'm not strong enough to be what she needs. Will you? No way. Absolutely not. If you're going to do this, you tell her yourself. But David was already moving toward the bathroom's back exit, the one that led to the parking lot behind the church. His car waited in the space reserved for the groom, keys in his pocket, escape route planned. Tell her I'm sorry, he called over his shoulder. Tell her she deserves someone who can love her completely, not someone who stays out of obligation. The door slammed behind him, leaving Trevor alone with the abandoned wedding ring and the impossible task of explaining to a sanctuary full of people why the groom had fled through the bathroom window like a teenager escaping. Detention. Marcus Rodriguez had been riding for 3 hours through the Montana countryside when the storm clouds gathered. Rain began as light drops on his windshield, then intensified until he could barely see the road ahead. The small church appeared through the downpour like salvation, a simple white building with a cross silhouetted against the grey sky. He pulled his Harley into the parking lot, noting the cars arranged for what looked like a wedding. Perfect. He'd wait out the storm in the back pew, slip away when the ceremony ended. Churches usually left their doors unlocked during services, and he needed shelter more than he needed to avoid social situations. The leather. The patch on his jacket read Prospect, a reminder of the brutal initiation process that had earned him membership in the Hells Angels chapter. 3 years ago, he'd endured beatings, humiliation, and tests of loyalty that would have broken weaker men. The patch represented survival, but also the violence that had become his identity since leaving the army. Afghanistan felt like another lifetime now, though the nightmares still came. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, combat medic, 2nd Battalion, 10th Mountain Division. He'd been responsible for keeping his unit alive, patching wounds under fire, making life-or-death decisions in split seconds, until the day the IED took out his convoy and left him as the sole survivor. 23 soldiers dead, 1 medic alive to tell the story. The mathematics of survival had never made sense to him. The VA counselors had words for what he experienced: survivor's guilt, post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated grief. They offered medication and therapy and support. Groups full of veterans who nodded knowingly when he described the weight of breathing when better men couldn't, but pills couldn't. Erase the faces of soldiers he'd failed to save. And talking about feelings felt like weakness to someone trained to compartmentalize trauma. The Hells Angels had found him in a bar outside Fort Carson, drunk and looking for a fight that might finally put him out of his misery. Instead of beating him senseless, they'd offered him something he hadn't expected: brotherhood built on shared damage. Men who understood that some experiences changed you fundamentally, made civilian life feel like wearing clothes that no longer fit. The club's initiation had been brutal, but familiar. Physical pain he could handle. It was the emotional weight that threatened to crush him daily. The prospect patch meant he'd proven himself capable of violence when necessary, but also that he was still earning his place among men who'd made peace with being society's outlaws. His reputation as an enforcer had developed naturally. When disputes needed settling or debts required collection, Marcus was the member other clubs feared to face. 6'3", 240 pounds of muscle and barely contained rage made him effective at his job. People saw the leather jacket and the scars and got out of his way, but they didn't see the Purple Heart hidden in his apartment drawer, or the Silver Star he'd earned dragging wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. They didn't know about the medic training that made him automatically assess everyone for injuries, or the way he still carried a first aid kit in his motorcycle saddlebags out of habit. The church door opened easily, revealing a sanctuary full of wedding guests and an atmosphere thick with tension. Marcus slipped into the back row, water dripping from his jacket onto the worn carpet. He intended to stay invisible until the storm passed, but something about the scene ahead caught his attention. A woman in a white dress sat alone at the altar in a wheelchair. No groom beside her. Guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats, checking phones and whispering. The bride's posture spoke of dignity under pressure. Shoulders straight, despite whatever crisis was unfolding. Marcus had seen that look before, soldiers maintaining composure while everything fell apart around them. It was the expression of someone refusing to break publicly, no matter how much private pain they carried. A man in a tuxedo approached the altar awkwardly, leaning down to whisper something to the bride. Her face went pale, but she didn't cry or collapse. She simply nodded and gripped her bouquet tighter, processing whatever devastating news she'd just received. The guests' whispers grew louder. Marcus caught fragments of conversation, knew this would happen. What did she expect? Such a shame. The casual cruelty in their voices triggered something protective in him that he thought the war had destroyed. This woman was under attack, surrounded by people who should have supported her, but were instead treating her misfortune as entertainment. Every instinct he'd developed as a medic screamed that someone here needed help, and everyone else was failing to provide it. Sarah's fingers traced the delicate silver locket at her throat, a nervous habit she'd developed since childhood. Inside the antique piece were tiny photographs of her parents, her mother's gentle smile and her father's kind eyes captured in sepia tones that had faded with time. Grandma Rose had given it to her on her 16th birthday, explaining it had belonged to her own mother. Something old, Grandma Rose had always said about family heirlooms. They carry the strength of the women who came before you. Now, sitting abandoned at the altar, Sarah drew on that inherited strength while her world crumbled around her. Trevor's whispered explanation still echoed in her mind. David said he's sorry. He said you deserve someone who can love you completely. The irony cut deep. David claimed she deserved complete love, while demonstrating the exact opposite. Conditional affection that evaporated when tested by adversity. The very people who should have shown her unconditional support were now providing her greatest lesson in its absence. Pastor Williams approached with the careful steps of someone navigating emotional quicksand. He'd married her parents 29 years ago in this same sanctuary, had officiated at their funeral when she was 8. His weathered face showed genuine distress at the situation unfolding before his altar. "Sarah, dear, what would you like me to tell everyone?" She looked out at the 40 guests, noting how they'd naturally divided into camps. About half showed genuine sympathy and concern. Her nursing colleagues, Grandma Rose's elderly friends, neighbors who'd watched her grow up. But the other half leaned forward with barely concealed excitement, witnessing drama they'd discussed for months. Mrs. Henderson from down the street had her phone out, probably texting updates to friends who hadn't attended. The Morrison family exchanged meaningful looks that clearly said, "We knew this would happen." David's cousins whispered among themselves, already crafting the story they'd tell at family gatherings. "Tell them," Sarah said clearly, her voice carrying across the sanctuary, "that sometimes life gives us exactly what we need, even when it's not what we expected." The guests fell silent, straining to hear her words. Sarah had spent 6 months learning to project her voice from a seated position, and now that training served her well, Jenny rushed forward from the 3rd row, her maid-of-honor dress rustling as she knelt beside Sarah's wheelchair. They'd been friends since nursing school, had survived clinical rotations and board exams together. Jenny's eyes blazed with protective fury. "I'm going to kill him," Jenny whispered fiercely. Slowly, with medical precision. "No," Sarah replied, surprising herself with her calm tone. "He did me a favor." Jenny's expression shifted from anger to concern. "Honey, you're in shock. Let's get you out of here." But Sarah wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. This moment required witnessing, processing, understanding. 6 months of doubt and compromise had led to this clarity. She didn't want a man who stayed out of obligation or pity. David's abandonment hurt, but his honesty, however cruel in delivery, was a gift. The storm outside intensified, rain drumming against the church's stained glass windows. Lightning illuminated the sanctuary in brief dramatic flashes that seemed to underscore the surreal nature of the situation. Several guests checked their watches, clearly calculating how long they needed to remain before politeness allowed their escape. Sarah's gaze fell on the stranger in the back row. He sat perfectly still among the chaos, a massive figure in leather who seemed oddly out of place yet completely at ease. Most people would have felt intimidated by his presence, but something about his stillness calmed her. He wasn't staring at her with pity or curiosity. He was simply present, solid as a mountain in the storm. "Sarah," Pastor Williams said gently, "would you like me to dismiss everyone? We could handle this privately." She considered the offer. The easy path would be to flee, to hide her humiliation and process this devastation away from public scrutiny. But running would validate everyone's assumption that she was fragile, that disability made her incapable of handling life's challenges with grace. Grandma. Rose had faced public humiliation when Sarah's grandfather left her with 3 young children and no income. Instead of hiding, she'd held her head high, worked 3 jobs, and raised her family with dignity, intact. The locket's weight reminded Sarah that strength ran in her blood. "No," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm going to sit here for a moment and appreciate that I just learned something important about the man I almost married. And then I'm going to leave this church with my dignity intact." The silver cross hung beneath Marcus's leather jacket, hidden from view but present against his chest with every heartbeat. Most people saw only the Hells Angels patches and assumed he'd abandoned any connection to faith or healing. They didn't know about the combat medic cross he'd earned in Afghanistan or the oath he'd taken to help the wounded regardless of circumstances. "I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade." The words of the soldier's creed echoed in his mind as he watched the drama unfold at the altar. Sarah Matthews sat abandoned in her wedding dress, and every instinct Marcus had developed as a medic told him someone was under attack and needed assistance. The fact that the assault was emotional rather than physical didn't make it less urgent. His fellow club members would tell him to stay out of it. Razor and Tank, who'd ridden with him to Montana for a regional meeting, had already texted asking about his location. Getting involved in civilian problems wasn't club business, especially problems involving weddings and domestic drama. But Marcus couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face, composed despite devastation, maintaining dignity under fire. He'd seen that expression on soldiers who'd been wounded but refused to show weakness in front of their unit. It was the look of someone drawing on reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. Holding the line when everything else was falling apart, the guests continued their cruel theater, some openly staring, while others pretended to check phones or study the church's stained glass windows. Their whispered conversations carried fragments of judgment. Always knew he'd come to his senses. What was he thinking? Dodged a bullet there. Marcus's hands clenched into fists. In Afghanistan, they'd had clear rules of engagement. You could identify the enemy and respond accordingly. Here the threat was more insidious. These people were destroying someone's spirit with gossip and casual cruelty, and there was no protocol for responding to that kind of attack. The pastor approached Sarah again, clearly struggling with a situation no seminary had prepared him for. The bride's friend knelt beside the wheelchair, offering support that seemed genuine but inadequate for the magnitude of public humiliation Sarah was enduring. Marcus remembered the last soldier he'd failed to save, Private Johnson, 19 years old, hit by shrapnel from the same IED that had killed the rest of their convoy. Johnson had looked at Marcus with the same dignified composure Sarah showed now, refusing to cry or beg, even as life drained from his eyes. "Doc," Johnson had whispered, "tell my mom I wasn't scared." Marcus had lied then, promised Johnson would tell his mother himself, that the medevac helicopter would arrive in time. But Johnson died holding Marcus's hand, and Marcus had carried the weight of that final moment for 3 years. Every day since, he'd wondered if there was something more he could have done, some way to save a life that slipped away despite his best efforts. This moment felt different. Sarah wasn't dying, but she was wounded in ways that could define the rest of her life. The crowd's cruelty was inflicting damage that might never heal properly, leaving scars that would affect how she saw herself and how she trusted others. Thunder crashed outside, punctuating the tension in the sanctuary. Several guests jumped at the sound, their nervous laughter revealing how uncomfortable everyone felt with the situation. But no one was doing anything to help. They were all waiting for someone else to take action, to provide the leadership that would resolve the crisis. Marcus stood slowly, his movement drawing attention from nearby guests. At 6'3" and weighing 240 pounds, he commanded space in ways that made people notice. His leather jacket creaked as he stepped into the aisle, combat boots silent on the carpeted floor. He'd learned to move quietly in war zones, advancing on enemies who couldn't hear him coming. But this wasn't about stealth. This was about presence, about showing up when someone needed assistance. The combat medic cross pressed against his chest, a reminder of the oath he'd taken to serve others, regardless of personal cost. As he walked toward the altar, Marcus felt the weight of 40 stares following his progress. Some guests recoiled instinctively from his appearance. Others watched with fascination. He ignored them all, focused entirely on the woman who sat alone at the altar, maintaining her dignity while her world collapsed around her. Sarah looked up as his shadow fell across her wheelchair, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that reminded him why he'd become a medic in the first place. The recognition that help had arrived, that someone was finally willing to act instead of just observe. Sarah's wheelchair represented more than mobility. It was her declaration of independence. The lightweight titanium frame had cost $18,000 from her settlement money, custom fitted to her measurements and preferences. Purple spoke, guards reflected her personality, while the quick-release wheels allowed her to break it down for transport. Every modification spoke to her determination to adapt rather than surrender. She'd researched wheelchair options for months after her accident, reading reviews and testing models until she found one that felt like an extension of her body rather than medical equipment. The chair's responsiveness had restored some sense of control over her environment, allowing her to navigate curbs and doorways with confidence. Now, as the intimidating stranger approached her altar, Sarah's hands instinctively gripped her chair's push rims. Fight or flight responses were complicated when flight required wheels instead of legs, but her chair had never felt more essential to her autonomy. The man stopped 3 feet away, close enough to speak privately, far enough to avoid crowding her personal space. His massive frame cast a shadow across her white dress, but his eyes held something unexpected. Respect. Not pity, not curiosity, not the careful politeness she'd grown accustomed to since her accident. Just straightforward acknowledgement of her as a complete person. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl. "Looks like you could use an escort out of here." Sarah studied his face, noting the scars that crisscrossed his left cheek and the way he held his shoulders, military bearing disguised beneath leather and attitude. His Hell's Angels jacket should have terrified her, but something in his manner suggested protection rather than threat. "I don't even know your name," she replied, surprised by her own calm tone. "Marcus Rodriguez. And you don't need to know anything else about me except that I don't leave people behind when they're under fire." Under fire. The military terminology struck her as oddly appropriate. The guests' whispers and stares felt like enemy action, coordinated assault on her dignity and self-worth. Marcus seemed to understand that dynamic in ways civilian politeness couldn't address. Jenny stood protectively beside Sarah's chair, clearly torn between gratitude for potential assistance and concern about accepting help from someone who looked like trouble incarnate. "Sarah," Jenny whispered urgently, "maybe we should just—" "What are you suggesting?" Sarah asked Marcus, cutting off her friend's worried objection. "Walk you out of here with your head high. Let everyone see that what happened here today doesn't define you." He paused, then added, "Unless you'd rather handle this differently." The offer intrigued her. David's abandonment had left her feeling powerless, but Marcus was presenting an alternative, agency in how she responded to crisis. She could flee in humiliation, or she could make a statement about her own worth. Mrs. Henderson in the third row had her phone out again, probably recording the interaction for social media. The Morrison family leaned forward eagerly, clearly hoping for additional drama to feed their gossip networks. Even Pastor Williams watched nervously, uncertain whether this development would help or worsen the situation. "Why would you do that?" Sarah asked. "You don't know me." Marcus considered the question seriously, his gaze never leaving her face. "Because someone should. And because I recognize strength when I see it." The simple statement hit harder than elaborate speeches about inspiration or overcoming obstacles. Marcus wasn't treating her disability as either tragedy or triumph. He was acknowledging her as someone capable of making her own choices about how to respond to adversity. Sarah's grandmother had always taught her that character revealed itself in moments of crisis. How you handled disappointment, betrayal, and public humiliation showed the world who you really were beneath social facades. This moment would define her more than any wedding ceremony could have. "Jenny," Sarah said, still looking at Marcus, "would you get my purse from the vestry?" Jenny hesitated, clearly uncomfortable leaving Sarah alone with the intimidating stranger. But Sarah's tone carried authority that brooked no argument. As Jenny reluctantly headed toward the back of the church, Sarah made her decision. She adjusted her chair's position to face the congregation more directly, her movement smooth and confident, despite the emotional upheaval of the past hour. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said formally, "I would appreciate your assistance leaving this church." Marcus nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed respect for her courage and commitment to seeing her safely through whatever came next. He positioned himself slightly behind and to the left of her wheelchair, close enough to provide support, positioned to shield her from the worst of the gawking crowd. "Ready when you are." "Ma'am?" Hidden beneath layers of clothing and leather in Marcus's apartment, wrapped in tissue paper inside a wooden box, lay the Purple Heart medal he'd never worn publicly. The brass heart-shaped medal bore the profile of George Washington and the inscription, "For Military Merit." Below it, a purple ribbon with white edges represented wounds received in service to his country. Marcus had earned it the day the IED destroyed his convoy outside Kandahar, when shrapnel from the blast embedded itself in his shoulder and back while he dragged 3 wounded soldiers to safety. The same explosion that killed his brother Carlos, who'd been riding in the lead vehicle as point man for their patrol. The medal felt like mockery now. Honor for surviving when better men died. Recognition for wounds that healed while emotional scars remained open and bleeding 3 years later. He'd thrown it in the box the day he got his discharge papers and hadn't looked at it since joining the Hells Angels. But standing in this church sanctuary, watching Sarah navigate her own battlefield with grace under pressure, Marcus understood something about courage that military decorations couldn't capture. Real bravery wasn't about charging enemy positions or pulling wounded soldiers from burning vehicles. Sometimes it was about maintaining dignity when the world conspired to strip it away. As they prepared to leave the church, Marcus noticed details his medic training had taught him to observe. Sarah's elevated heart rate evidenced by the pulse visible at her throat. The slight tremor in her hands that suggested adrenaline response to stress. The careful control of her facial expression that spoke to someone managing pain beyond the physical. The guests parted like water as they moved down the aisle, some stepping into pews to clear a wider path. Marcus kept his attention focused ahead, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed their progress. This wasn't about him. It was about providing Sarah with the dignified exit she deserved. The church's front steps presented the first practical challenge. 3 concrete steps separated the sanctuary from the parking lot, and the church's accessibility ramp was located around the side of the building. Marcus had noticed the layout during his arrival, cataloging potential obstacles the way his military training had taught him to assess terrain. "There's a ramp on the north side," he said quietly. "I know," Sarah replied. "But that would mean going around the building in the rain, and honestly, I'm tired of taking the long way around things." Marcus understood immediately. The steps weren't just a physical barrier. They represented every obstacle society placed between disabled people and full participation in normal activities. Sarah was choosing to confront this symbolically charged moment rather than accept accommodation that felt like concession. "How do you want to handle it?" Sarah studied the steps with the calculating gaze of someone who'd learned to navigate an inaccessible world through careful planning and creative problem-solving. Her wheelchair's anti-tip wheels could handle mild inclines, but 3 steps down required assistance. "Can you help me down backward?" "It's easier to control the descent that way." Marcus nodded, positioning himself in front of her chair to guide the descent. The technique required trust. Sarah had to rely on his strength and balance while surrendering control of her movement. For someone who'd fought to regain independence after her accident, that vulnerability represented significant faith in a stranger. As they negotiated the steps, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. Not the crushing obligation that drove David away, but the familiar burden of keeping someone safe under difficult circumstances. This was what he'd trained for, what felt natural despite the civilian context. The rain had intensified while they were inside, turning the church parking lot into a maze of puddles and streaming gutters. Marcus's motorcycle sat where he'd left it, chrome gleaming despite the downpour. Several wedding guests huddled under umbrellas near their cars, watching the drama play out while staying dry. "Where to?" Marcus asked, raising his voice over the storm. Sarah looked around the parking lot, noting Jenny's car among the vehicles waiting to provide rides home. Her own modified Honda sat near the church entrance, hand controls allowing her to drive independently despite her paralysis. But something about this moment demanded a different choice. Safety and familiarity waited in Jenny's passenger seat or her own driver's position. Adventure and the unknown beckoned from the back of Marcus's Harley. "I've never ridden a motorcycle," Sarah said, water dripping from her hair as rain soaked through her wedding dress. Marcus smiled, the first genuine expression of joy she'd seen from anyone all day. "Then today seems like a good day to start the Hells Angels Club." Rules were tattooed in Gothic script across Marcus's ribs, each line etched in black ink that had faded slightly over 3 years, but remained perfectly legible. "Respect few, fear none," curved along his lower ribs. "When we do right, nobody remembers. When we do wrong, nobody forgets," wrapped around his side. The words represented both salvation and prison, the brotherhood that had saved him from self-destruction while binding him to a life of perpetual rebellion. Marcus helped Sarah transfer from her wheelchair to the back of his Harley, her wedding dress hiking up as she maneuvered into position. The rain had plastered the white fabric to her legs, making the contrast between sensation and numbness visible in ways that fully abled people rarely considered. Above her waist, she shivered from cold and adrenaline. Below, her legs remained still and unresponsive. "You'll need to hold on tight," Marcus said, starting the engine. The Harley's rumble echoed off the church walls, drowning out the gasps and exclamations from wedding guests who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Sarah wrapped her arms around Marcus's waist, feeling the leather of his jacket and the solid warmth of his body beneath it. The motorcycle vibrated with barely contained power, and she understood why people became addicted to this sensation of controlled danger. As they pulled out of the church parking lot, Sarah caught a glimpse of Jenny's horrified face through a car window. Her best friend was probably calling the police, certain that Sarah had been kidnapped by a psychotic biker who'd taken advantage of her emotional vulnerability. The thought made Sarah laugh out loud, the sound lost in the wind and engine noise. They rode through the town's main street at precisely the speed limit, Marcus careful not to give local law enforcement any excuse to pull them over. Sarah had lived in this community her entire life, but seeing it from the back of a motorcycle transformed familiar sights into something foreign and exciting. The Methodist church where she'd attended youth group passed on the left. The elementary school where she'd learned to read occupied the next block. The hospital where she'd worked as a nurse until her accident stood imposing and white against the storm clouds. Each building represented a different phase of her life, but from this new perspective, they felt like scenes from someone else's story. People on sidewalks stopped to stare at the unlikely pair. A bride in a wedding dress riding behind a Hells Angels member through downtown on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah imagined the phone calls already being made, the social media posts documenting her scandalous behavior, the judgment that would follow her for months. For the first time since her accident, she didn't care what other people thought. The freedom was intoxicating. Not just the physical sensation of movement and speed, but the emotional liberation of choosing adventure over safety, spontaneity over careful planning. Every decision she'd made since her accident had been filtered through considerations of accessibility, practicality, and other people's comfort levels. This moment belonged entirely to her. Marcus turned onto Highway 87, heading away from town toward the mountains. The road stretched ahead through pine forests and meadows, offering possibilities Sarah hadn't considered in months. She could go anywhere, be anyone, start over completely if she chose. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. They pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, a truck stop that had served travelers for 40 years. The building's neon sign flickered in the storm, casting red and blue light across puddles in the gravel lot. Semi-trucks idled in designated parking areas while their drivers grabbed coffee and meals during mandatory rest breaks. Marcus helped Sarah transfer back to her wheelchair, which he'd somehow secured to the bike's rear rack during their hasty departure from the church. The engineering impressed her. He'd clearly thought through the logistics of transporting someone who used a wheelchair, suggesting this wasn't entirely spontaneous. Inside the diner, conversations stopped as they entered. A bride in a soaked wedding dress and a Hells Angels member made for unusual customers, even in a place accustomed to eccentric travelers. But the waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and no apparent judgment, simply smiled and asked, "Booth or table?" "Booth," Sarah said, before Marcus could suggest accommodations for her wheelchair. As they settled into the red vinyl seats, Sarah studied Marcus's face in the diner's fluorescent lighting. The scars she'd noticed in the church were more visible now, suggesting violence in his past that went beyond typical bar fights or motorcycle accidents. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For treating me like I could make my own choices." The nursing license hung framed on Sarah's apartment wall, a reminder of dreams that had died with her accident. Sarah Elizabeth Matthews, registered nurse, state of Montana, was printed in official black lettering, surrounded by gold embossing that had once made her proud. Now it mocked her daily, representing a profession she could no longer pursue due to hospital administrators who saw liability instead of capability. Sarah unlocked her apartment door with Marcus following quietly behind. The space reflected 5 years of careful adaptation. Grab bars in strategic locations, lowered countertops in the kitchen, a roll-in shower that had cost 3 months of disability payments. Everything designed for independence, for proving she didn't need anyone's help or pity. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was bringing home a stranger on the day she was supposed to have started her new life as David's wife. But Marcus felt less like a stranger and more like someone who understood survival in ways most people couldn't comprehend. "Nice place," Marcus said, genuinely meaning it. The apartment was small but organized. decorated with photographs and plants that showed someone had made a real home here despite limited resources. Sarah transferred from her wheelchair to the couch, her movements smooth and practiced. The wedding dress that had represented hope and tradition now felt like costume jewelry, beautiful but ultimately worthless. She began working at the dozens of tiny buttons that ran down the back, frustration mounting as her tired fingers struggled with the delicate fastenings. "Need help?" Marcus asked, his tone carefully neutral. The offer should have embarrassed her. Accepting assistance with something as intimate as undressing violated every principle of independence she'd fought to establish. But the day's events had exhausted her emotional reserves, and practical needs trumped pride. "The buttons," she said simply, turning to give him access to her back. Marcus's fingers worked the tiny pearl buttons with surprising gentleness, his calloused hands careful not to catch the delicate fabric. He'd learned precision during medical training, when working on wounded soldiers required steady hands and infinite patience. "You were a nurse," he observed, noting the framed license and medical textbooks that lined one wall was being the operative phrase. Apparently, hospitals consider wheelchair-using nurses a liability issue. Bitterness crept into her voice, despite her efforts to remain matter-of-fact. Marcus continued working the buttons, his movements methodical and respectful. "Their loss. Good medics are hard to find." The casual confidence in his statement surprised her. Most people offered sympathy or encouragement about finding alternative careers. Marcus simply acknowledged her competence as fact, without qualification or condescension. "Were you really a medic?" she asked. "Army, 3 tours in Afghanistan. Kept a lot of soldiers breathing who shouldn't have made it home." The simple statement carried weight that Sarah recognized from her own medical training. Life and death decisions, split-second judgments, the responsibility of holding someone's survival in your hands. She understood the toll that kind of work extracted from the people who chose it. What happened? Marcus finished with the buttons and stepped back, allowing her privacy to change. "ID took out my convoy. I was the only one who walked away." Sometimes walking away isn't the blessing people think it is. Survivor's guilt. Sarah had seen it in trauma patients. The psychological wounds that cut deeper than physical injuries. Marcus carried scars that went beyond the visible marks on his face and hands. "Is that why you joined the motorcycle club?" "Partly. They understood that some things change you permanently. Civilian life felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit anymore." Sarah disappeared into her bedroom to change, returning in jeans and a sweater that felt infinitely more comfortable than the wedding dress. The transformation was symbolic, shedding the costume of who she was supposed to be for the reality of who she actually was. Marcus had moved to the window, looking out at the street where neighbors were probably already spreading gossip about the Hells Angels motorcycle parked in front of Sarah's building. His presence would complicate her life in ways she hadn't considered, but she found herself caring less about community opinion than she had in years. "Coffee?" she offered, maneuvering her wheelchair toward the kitchen. That would be good. As Sarah prepared coffee with the efficient movements of someone who'd adapted their entire environment for wheelchair access, Marcus studied the photographs that covered her refrigerator. Pictures of her with patients at the hospital, graduation from nursing school, family gatherings with an elderly woman who shared Sarah's determined smile. "Your grandmother?" he asked, pointing to several photos of the older woman. "Grandma Rose. She raised me after my parents died. Taught me that strength comes from how you handle what life throws at you, not from avoiding difficulty." Marcus nodded, understanding immediately. Military families learned similar lessons about resilience and adaptation. Circumstances changed, but character remained constant. David's letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by certified mail with his familiar handwriting on expensive stationery. The envelope sat unopened on Sarah's kitchen table for hours before she found the courage to read his carefully crafted explanation and plea for forgiveness. Each paragraph revealed the shallow reasoning behind his abandonment. wrapped in language designed to make his cowardice sound like noble sacrifice. Sarah was transferring laundry from washer to dryer when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw David standing on her porch with a bouquet of roses, red ones this time, not the white flowers she'd carried in her wedding bouquet. His appearance was carefully calculated, freshly shaven, wearing the blue shirt she'd always complimented, holding flowers like a peace offering. She almost didn't answer. 3 days of quiet reflection, with occasional visits from Marcus, had given her perspective on just how toxic her relationship with David had become. His absence felt like recovering from an illness she hadn't realized was making her sick, but curiosity won out. She opened the door, noting how David's eyes immediately dropped to her wheelchair before returning to her face, a habit that had always bothered her, but which she'd learned to ignore. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake." His rehearsed opening lacked conviction, delivered with the tone of someone who'd practiced the words but didn't fully believe them. Behind him, Mrs. Henderson from across the street pretended to water plants while obviously eavesdropping on the conversation. "David, what do you want?" "To explain, to make things right. I panicked, and I know that's not an excuse, but I wasn't thinking clearly." Sarah studied his face, noting the signs of stress and sleepless nights. But she also recognized the calculating expression he wore when trying to manage difficult situations. The same look he'd shown when discussing her medical bills or explaining why certain restaurants were too complicated for wheelchair access. "Come in," she said, backing her chair away from the door. David entered cautiously, taking in the apartment he'd visited dozens of times, but somehow seemed to see differently now. His gaze lingered on the framed photograph of Sarah and Marcus that Jenny had taken at the diner, both of them laughing at something Marcus had said, Sarah's face bright with genuine happiness. "Who's the guy in the picture?" "A friend. Someone who showed up when it mattered." David's jaw tightened. He'd clearly heard rumors about Sarah's motorcycle ride through town, probably embellished through multiple retellings into something scandalous and dangerous. "Sarah, people are talking. They're saying you left the church with some criminal, that you're making decisions you'll regret." The paternalistic tone triggered anger that surprised Sarah with its intensity. 6 months of David's subtle control and condescension crystallized into clarity about how he'd actually treated her throughout their relationship. "People have been talking about me since my accident. At least now they have something interesting to discuss." David set the roses on her coffee table, positioning himself in the chair across from her couch. The flowers looked expensive and artificially perfect. Hothouse blooms that would die within a week, beautiful but lacking substance. "I want to try again. We can postpone the wedding, take time to work through my concerns. I realize I handled everything badly." "Your concerns?" David's careful composure slipped slightly. "About the future. About whether I'm equipped to handle the challenges we'd face together." Sarah had learned to translate David's euphemisms over the past 6 months. Challenges meant her disability. Equipped to handle meant he saw her as a burden rather than a partner. His entire vocabulary around their relationship had been coded language that reduced her to a problem requiring management. "What changed your mind?" "I realized how much I love you, how much we've built together. 3 years doesn't just disappear because of one moment of weakness." The words sounded hollow, delivered without the conviction that real love required. Sarah recognized the difference now, having spent 3 days with someone who treated her as a complete person rather than a collection of limitations requiring accommodation. "David, do you remember what you said when I asked if we could go hiking after my accident?" David's expression grew wary. "I said we'd find other activities. Things that worked better for your situation. You said hiking was off the table permanently. That I needed to accept my new limitations and find hobbies that made sense for someone in my condition. I was being realistic. Marcus took me riding through the mountains yesterday. We stopped at 3 scenic overlooks I'd never seen before, even when I could walk. The comparison hung between them, stark and undeniable. David had spent 6 months teaching her to think smaller, while Marcus had shown her possibilities she'd never considered. Marcus's motorcycle keys lay on Sarah's kitchen counter, the metal worn smooth from years of use. The key ring held more than ignition access. It represented freedom, adventure, and his unspoken offer to share his world with someone brave enough to join him. Each scratch and nick in the metal told stories of journeys across state lines, midnight rides through mountain passes, and the kind of spontaneous adventure that David had systematically eliminated from Sarah's life. The confrontation with David had ended poorly. His face had cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally desperate pleading, as Sarah explained her decision with calm finality. She'd removed her engagement ring, the modest diamond he'd chosen, based on practical considerations rather than romance, and placed it in his palm with the same ceremony she might use to return a library book. "You can't be serious," David had said, staring at the ring. "You're choosing some criminal over 3 years of our relationship? I'm choosing someone who sees possibilities instead of limitations," Sarah had replied. Now 2 hours after David's departure, Sarah sat in her living room wondering if she'd made the right choice. Marcus was expected back from a club meeting, and the reality of her decision was settling in. She was falling for a man whose lifestyle was antithetical to everything she'd been taught to value. Stability, conventional success, social acceptance. The sound of Marcus's Harley in the parking lot sent her pulse racing. Through her window, she watched him remove his helmet and run a hand through his dark hair. Even at rest, he moved with the controlled alertness of someone always prepared for trouble. It should have been intimidating, but Sarah found his vigilance oddly comforting. His knock was gentle, despite his size. "It's open," she called, not wanting to navigate the wheelchair to the door again. Marcus entered carrying takeout bags from the Chinese restaurant downtown. "Figured you might not feel like cooking after your visitor left." Sarah was struck again by his thoughtfulness. He'd noticed David's car in the parking lot and given them privacy for their conversation, but had also anticipated she might need support afterward. The consideration felt foreign after months of David's self-centered approach to their relationship. "How did you know what I'd want to eat?" "Lucky guess. Plus, General Tso's chicken fixes most problems, at least temporarily." They ate in comfortable silence, using chopsticks while rain drummed against the windows. Marcus had an easy way of sharing space that didn't require constant conversation or entertainment. David had always filled silence with planning discussions or problem-solving sessions that exhausted Sarah's energy. "He wants me back," Sarah said finally. Marcus continued eating, his expression neutral. "What do you want?" The question's simplicity highlighted how rarely anyone asked about her desires without immediately following up with practical concerns or unsolicited advice. Marcus waited patiently while she formulated her thoughts. "I want to feel alive again. I want someone who sees adventure instead of obstacles. I want to matter to someone without having to apologize for existing." Sounds reasonable. Marcus's calm acceptance of her needs contrasted sharply with David's tendency to analyze and modify her requests based on his comfort level. She realized she'd been asking permission to want things for so long that direct acceptance felt revolutionary. "Marcus, what are we doing here? I mean, realistically, you're a Hells Angels member, I'm a disabled former nurse. We come from completely different worlds." Marcus set down his chopsticks and looked at her directly. "Maybe, or maybe we're both people who've learned that life doesn't follow the scripts everyone else writes for us." The observation resonated deeply. Sarah had spent 6 months trying to fit her post-accident life into pre-injury expectations, modifying dreams instead of creating new ones. Marcus lived entirely outside conventional expectations, which gave him freedom to see possibilities others missed. The club won't exactly welcome a girlfriend in a wheelchair. The club respects strength. They'll see yours pretty quickly. His confidence in her abilities felt like sunlight after months in shadow. David had loved her despite her disability, treating it as an unfortunate condition to be managed. Marcus seemed to appreciate her because of what she'd overcome, recognizing her adaptation as evidence of character rather than limitation. Sarah wheeled closer to where Marcus sat on her couch. The movement felt significant, literally and figuratively closing distance between their different worlds. "Are you offering me your world?" "I'm offering to share it." "Big difference." She leaned forward and kissed him, tasting freedom and possibility on his lips. The kiss was gentle but electric, carrying promises neither of them had spoken aloud, but both understood completely. The leather jacket arrived 6 months after Sarah and Marcus had left town together, custom-made by a craftsman in Denver who specialized in adaptive clothing. Black leather, with reinforced shoulders and elbows, but modified with magnetic closures instead of zippers, shortened sleeves for easier wheelchair maneuvering, and interior pockets positioned for seated access. The Hells Angels patches on the back marked her as Marcus's old lady, a designation that would have horrified her former self, but now felt like armor against a world that had never fully accepted her anyway. Sarah traced the silver studs along the jacket's front panel, each one positioned by hand according to specifications Marcus had provided without her knowledge. The surprise had arrived on the anniversary of their departure from Montana, accompanied by a note from the craftsman. "Every warrior needs proper gear. Ride safe, Tommy." Their new life in Colorado had exceeded every expectation Sarah had allowed herself to form. Denver's disability services were comprehensive. The Hells Angels chapter welcomed her with gruff acceptance that gradually warmed into genuine respect. And Marcus had found work as a trauma counselor at the Veterans Administration Hospital. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they'd both returned to healing professions, just through different paths than either had originally planned. Sarah's new non-profit organization, Veterans Adaptive Services, helped disabled veterans and their families navigate the complex transition from military to civilian life. Her combination of medical training and personal experience with disability made her uniquely qualified to understand the challenges these families faced. Marcus knocked on her office door, holding 2 cups of coffee from the shop downstairs. Their downtown location put them within walking distance of the VA hospital, the courthouse, and 3 other non-profit organizations that referred clients to their services. "How's the Henderson family coming along?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "Mrs. Henderson is finally accepting that her husband's traumatic brain injury is permanent, not something that will improve with positive thinking and determination. That's progress." Sarah had learned to navigate the complex emotions families experienced when military injuries disrupted their assumptions about strength, independence, and traditional gender roles. Her own experience provided credibility that no amount of professional training could duplicate. "Speaking of acceptance," Marcus said, producing an envelope from his jacket pocket. "This came to the house today." Sarah recognized the return address immediately, her former church in Montana, where her abandoned wedding had become local legend. Pastor Williams wrote with his careful script that some members of the congregation had established a fund to support her advocacy work. Having learned about her organization through online research, the letter included a check for $5,000 and a note, explaining that several families had been inspired by her story to examine their own prejudices about disability and difference. Mrs. Patterson, whose grandson had helped in the community garden, had become an activist for accessibility improvements throughout the county. Even Mrs. Henderson, Sarah asked, remembering the woman who'd recorded her humiliation on her cell phone, especially Mrs. Henderson. Apparently, her own grandson was diagnosed with autism last year, and she's learned some hard lessons about judgment and acceptance. Sarah folded the letter carefully, touched by the unexpected support from people who'd witnessed her lowest moment. The money would fund their next expansion, a pilot program pairing disabled veterans with mentor families who understood the daily realities of adaptation and resilience. Marcus pulled out his phone to show Sarah pictures from their weekend ride. Through Rocky Mountain National Park, they joined 12 other club members for a charity run benefiting military families. Sarah riding on the back of Marcus's bike through mountain passes that took her breath away. The photos captured moments of pure joy. Sarah laughing as mountain wind whipped her hair, both of them grinning beside alpine lakes that reflected snow-capped peaks. The entire group posed in front of their motorcycles like a family that had chosen each other rather than being connected by blood. "I never thought I'd see myself in leather," Sarah said, examining a photo where she wore her new jacket with obvious pride. "I never thought I'd be dating someone who could out-argue a VA bureaucrat and win disability benefits." For 3 families in one afternoon, their relationship had developed organically, built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than obligation or pity. Marcus's PTSD episodes had decreased significantly since he'd found meaningful work and stable partnership. Sarah's confidence had bloomed as she discovered her advocacy talents and saw the impact of her efforts on other families struggling with similar challenges. "Ready for tonight?" Marcus asked. Sarah nodded, checking her watch. They were attending the monthly Hells Angels Club meeting, where they would present their proposal for the motorcycle club to formally sponsor their veterans advocacy program. The partnership would provide funding, volunteer support, and the kind of street credibility that opened doors in communities suspicious of traditional social services. The wedding photograph sat framed on Sarah and Marcus's mantelpiece, capturing a moment of pure authenticity that contrasted sharply with the formal posed portraits most couples displayed. Shot outdoors against a backdrop of Colorado mountains, it showed Sarah in her leather jacket over a simple white dress, Marcus in his Hells Angels colors, surrounded by 20 club members who'd become their chosen family. No church sanctuary, no formal ceremony, no guests checking phones or whispering judgments. Just 2 people who'd found each other in the aftermath of separate devastations, pledging their commitment under an open sky with witnesses who understood that love sometimes bloomed in unlikely soil. Jenny had flown out from Montana for the celebration, initially horrified by the informal nature of the ceremony, but gradually won over by the genuine warmth of the motorcycle club community. She'd expected crude bikers and dangerous criminals, but found military veterans, skilled tradesmen, and family men who treated Sarah with protective respect, usually reserved for blood relatives. "I still can't believe you're married to a Hells Angel," Jenny had whispered during the reception, watching Marcus help elderly club member Pops transfer from his motorcycle to his wheelchair. "I'm married to Marcus," Sarah had corrected. "The Hells Angels thing is just part of the package." The photograph captured the moment immediately. After they'd exchanged rings, Marcus's massive hands gentle as he lifted Sarah's face for their first kiss as husband and wife. Her expression showed complete trust and joy. His revealed wonder at finding peace he'd thought was permanently lost in Afghan mountains. Tank, the club's president, had officiated the ceremony with surprising eloquence. A former Marine drill sergeant with tattoos covering both arms, he'd spoken about brotherhood, loyalty, and the families people create when blood relatives fail to provide what souls require. "Marriage ain't about finding someone perfect," Tank had said, his gravelly voice carrying across the meadow. "It's about finding someone whose imperfections fit with yours in ways that make both of you stronger." The reception had been potluck style, with club members' wives contributing dishes that reflected the organization's surprising diversity. Elena Rodriguez brought homemade tamales, her husband Reza having served 3 tours in Iraq before joining the club. Margaret Chen contributed Korean barbecue, honoring her late husband's military service in Vietnam. Children ran between the motorcycles parked in careful rows, their laughter mixing with classic rock music from a portable sound system. These families understood that community meant showing up for celebrations and crises with equal commitment. That chosen family often proved more reliable than biological connections, Marcus's sponsor, an older member called Wolfpack, had pulled Sarah aside during the evening's festivities. "You know what you did for that boy?" Wolfpack asked, his weathered face serious, despite the party atmosphere around them. "He saved me first," Sarah replied. "Nah, darling. He was drowning when you met him. Too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit he needed saving. You gave him purpose again." Sarah had watched Marcus throughout the evening, noting how naturally he interacted with children, how patiently he listened to elderly members' stories, how carefully he helped Pops navigate uneven ground. The man who'd intimidated a church full of wedding guests with his fierce appearance was gentle with anyone who needed assistance. The dancing had been creative, accommodating Sarah's wheelchair and Marcus's old shrapnel wounds with modifications that focused on connection rather than technique. They'd swayed together to songs that had meaning for them both, surrounded by couples who'd learned that love survived deployments, disabilities, and society's disapproval through daily choices to prioritize partnership over convenience. As the evening wound down and guests began loading motorcycles for the ride back to Denver, Sarah found herself reflecting on the year's journey. 12 months ago, she'd been preparing for a wedding that would have trapped her in a relationship built on pity and obligation. Tonight, she was celebrating a marriage founded on mutual respect and genuine partnership. The photograph would remind them both of this moment when future challenges tested their commitment. Marriage counselors warned that relationships formed during crisis often struggled when normal life resumed. But Sarah and Marcus had built their connection on shared values rather than dramatic circumstances. Marcus approached with 2 bottles of beer, settling onto the blanket beside her wheelchair as the last of their guests departed. "No regrets?" he asked, following her gaze to the mountains silhouetted against the sunset. "Only that it took so long to find you. Had to go through some hell first." "Both of us," Sarah nodded, understanding that their separate traumas had prepared them to appreciate what they'd found together. David's abandonment had taught her to recognize authentic love when it appeared. Marcus's survival guilt had made him treasure opportunities to protect and support someone who truly needed him. Sarah's business cards were simple but powerful. Sarah Rodriguez, Executive Director, Veterans Adaptive Services, printed in navy blue on cream cardstock. The non-profit's logo featured an eagle rising from flames, symbolizing renewal through adversity. Each card represented a victory against those who'd written her off after her accident, proof that disability didn't disqualify her from meaningful professional achievement. The organization had grown from a 2-person operation to a staff of 12, serving veterans and their families across 3 states. Sarah's combination of medical expertise and personal experience with disability made her uniquely effective at connecting with clients who'd lost hope in traditional support. Today's intake appointment involved the Patterson family, Sergeant First Class Robert Patterson, who'd lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan, his wife Maria, and their twin 8-year-old daughters. Robert sat rigidly in his wheelchair, jaw clenched with the pride that often prevented veterans from accepting help they desperately needed. "We don't need charity," Robert said before Sarah had fully introduced herself. "I just want information about job training programs." Sarah recognized the defensive posture, the way Robert positioned his wheelchair to project strength despite his obvious exhaustion. She'd worked with hundreds of families, navigating similar struggles between independence and practical necessity. "I'm not offering charity," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm offering resources that you've earned through your service." "There's a difference." Maria Patterson sat beside her husband, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting sleepless nights and financial stress. The twins fidgeted in their chairs, too young to understand their father's struggle, but old enough to sense the family's tension. "Robert's been having trouble finding work," Maria said quietly. "Employers see the wheelchair and suddenly have concerns about safety, insurance, accommodations. It's been 8 months since his discharge. Sarah nodded, pulling out a folder thick with documentation. Her organization had compiled comprehensive data on employment discrimination against disabled veterans, legal resources for fighting wrongful dismissal, in companies with proven track records of inclusive hiring practices. What was your specialty in the Army? Sarah asked Robert, logistics coordinator. Supply chain management, inventory control, personnel scheduling. His voice carried pride in expertise that civilian employers seemed determined to overlook. Perfect. I have contacts at 3 companies actively seeking logistics coordinators, and all 3 have adaptive technology specialists on staff. They understand that military logistics experience translates directly to civilian supply chain operations. Robert's defensive posture softened slightly. Sarah had learned that veterans responded better to concrete opportunities than abstract encouragement. They needed proof that their skills had value outside military context. There's also the matter of adaptive equipment, Sarah continued, producing a catalogue of workplace modifications. Adjustable desks, specialized software, ergonomic accommodations. Most employers don't realize how minimal these adaptations are, or that there's federal funding available to cover costs. Marcus appeared in the doorway, returning from a client meeting at the VA hospital. He wore business casual clothing instead of his leather jacket, but his military bearing remained evident in his posture and direct gaze. Marcus Rodriguez, he said, shaking Robert's hand. Former Army medic, current trauma counselor, also Sarah's husband. The introduction worked its intended magic. Robert relaxed visibly, recognizing a fellow veteran who understood military culture and the challenges of civilian transition. Sarah had learned that Marcus's presence often helped skeptical clients accept services they might otherwise refuse. You were deployed? Robert asked. 3 tours. Lost my entire unit to an IED outside Kandahar. Took me a while to figure out how to live with that. The simple statement carried weight that civilian counselors couldn't match. Marcus didn't minimize trauma or offer false optimism. He acknowledged the reality of wounds that might never fully heal, while demonstrating that meaningful life remained possible. Maria Patterson leaned forward with interest. How did you transition to civilian work? Badly at first, Marcus admitted. Spent a couple years making terrible decisions before I found purpose again. Sarah helped me understand that survival guilt doesn't honor the dead. Using your experience to help other people does. Sarah watched the family's dynamics shift as hope began replacing desperation. The twins stopped fidgeting, sensing their parents' reduce stress. Maria's shoulders relaxed for the first time since entering the office. We've developed a comprehensive support program, Sarah explained. Job placement assistance, family counseling, financial planning, recreational therapy. The goal isn't just employment, it's rebuilding complete lives. Robert studied the materials spread across Sarah's desk. Professional skepticism, battling with obvious need for the services being offered. What's the catch? No catch. Just an expectation that you'll help the next veteran family that comes through our doors. Success is something we pay forward, not something we hoard. The therapy session notes lay scattered across Marcus's desk at home, written in his careful handwriting during 18 months of intensive PTSD treatment. Each page documented progress through trauma that had controlled his life since Afghanistan. Nightmares becoming less frequent, survivor guilt transforming into purposeful action, rage channeling into advocacy for veterans struggling with similar demons. Dr. Amanda Torres had been his therapist, a former military psychologist who understood combat trauma from professional training and personal experience. Her husband had been killed in Iraq, leaving her to raise 2 children while processing her own grief and anger at senseless loss. Healing isn't about forgetting, Dr. Torres had written in her assessment notes. It's about integrating traumatic experiences into a narrative that allows forward movement rather than cyclical suffering. Marcus reviewed the notes periodically, tracking his journey from barely functional veteran to trauma counselor, helping other families navigate similar challenges. The Hells Angels had provided brotherhood and structure when civilian life felt impossible. But Sarah had given him something more valuable, purpose, that honored his military training while building meaningful civilian identity. Tonight marked his final session with Dr. Torres. After 18 months of weekly appointments, he'd achieved the stability necessary to trust his own judgment about emotional regulation and stress management. The accomplishment felt significant, representing hard-fought victory over invisible wounds that had threatened to destroy him. Sarah waited in the parking lot outside Dr. Torres's office, reading case files while Marcus completed his appointment. Their evening routine included debriefing about their respective days, sharing insights from clients who reminded them of their own struggles and victories. "How did it go?" Sarah asked as Marcus settled into the passenger seat of their adapted Honda. "Graduated," Marcus replied, producing a certificate Dr. Torres had created, recognizing his commitment to healing. "She says, I'm ready to trust my own judgment about managing triggers and emotional responses." Sarah smiled, understanding the significance of this milestone. Marcus's recovery had been methodical and thorough, addressing not just symptoms but underlying beliefs about worth, survival, and his right to happiness after trauma. Their drive home took them through downtown Denver, past the VA hospital where Marcus worked and the office building housing Sarah's non-profit organization. The geographic proximity wasn't coincidental. They'd chosen their home and work locations to support veterans who often struggled with transportation and accessibility issues. "Robert Patterson called this afternoon," Sarah said, referencing the veteran family they'd helped 6 months earlier. "He got promoted to regional logistics manager. Wants to speak at our next fundraising dinner about the difference our programs made for his family." Marcus nodded with satisfaction. Success stories like Robert's validated their decision to dedicate their lives to veteran advocacy rather than pursuing more lucrative career options. Military families faced unique challenges that civilian support services often failed to address effectively. Their home sat in a quiet neighborhood that welcomed diversity without demanding conformity. Children played in yards while parents worked on weekend projects, creating the kind of community stability both Sarah and Marcus had craved during their respective recoveries. Inside, Marcus's therapy notes joined a growing collection of professional development materials, continuing education certificates, and client testimonials that documented their evolving expertise in trauma recovery and disability advocacy. "I want to show you something," Sarah said, producing a leather portfolio from her desk drawer. The portfolio contained architectural plans for a residential facility designed specifically for veterans transitating from military to civilian life. The drawings showed accessible apartments, community meeting spaces, occupational therapy workshops, and recreational areas that could accommodate various disability needs. "Tank approached me last week," Sarah explained. "The Hells Angels want to sponsor construction of a transition facility. They're prepared to donate land and provide volunteer labor for a project that serves military families." Marcus studied the plans, noting details that reflected deep understanding of veteran needs. Private apartments for family dignity, communal areas for peer support, workshop spaces for vocational training, recreational facilities that accommodated adaptive equipment. How many families could this serve? 24 apartments, plus temporary housing for families in crisis. "We could probably help 200 veteran families annually, maybe more." The numbers represented lives changed, families stabilized, veterans who might avoid homelessness or suicide through access to comprehensive support services. Marcus thought about the soldiers he'd been unable to save in Afghanistan and how this facility might honor their memory through helping veterans who'd survived similar trauma. "When do we start?" Sarah's smile carried the same determination Marcus had first seen at the church altar 18 months ago. the refusal to accept limitations other people imposed, the commitment to creating possibilities where others saw only obstacles. Next month, Tank says the club's ready to break ground as soon as permits are approved. The wedding announcement arrived in Sarah's email 2 years after her own abandoned ceremony, forwarded by Jenny with a brief note. "Thought you should see this." David's engagement photo showed him posed beside Catherine Westbrook, daughter of the prominent banking family, both of them dressed in country club attire that spoke of wealth and social status. The announcement described an elaborate destination wedding in the Bahamas, with a guest list that read like a society directory. Sarah studied the photograph while eating breakfast, noting how carefully David had positioned himself to suggest confidence and success. Catherine was undeniably beautiful in the conventional way that society magazines celebrated. Blonde, thin, expensively dressed, and radiating the kind of privilege that made life's challenges seem abstract rather than immediate. Interesting choice, Marcus commented, reading over Sarah's shoulder as he poured coffee. She's exactly what he always wanted. Beautiful, wealthy, socially connected, and most importantly, she can walk down church aisles without assistance. There was no bitterness in Sarah's observation, just clinical assessment of David's priorities. The man who'd abandoned her at the altar had found exactly the life he'd always envisioned, one uncompromised by physical limitations, emotional depth, or the kind of challenges that required character to overcome. The wedding announcement included details about Catherine's charity work with children's literacy programs and her volunteer efforts at the country club's annual fundraising events. Sarah recognized the difference between charity and advocacy. Catherine helped from a position of privilege and safety, while Sarah worked alongside people whose struggles she understood personally. Marcus sat across from her at their kitchen table, reviewing case files for the day's client appointments. Morning sunlight streamed through windows overlooking their backyard garden, where vegetables grew in raised beds designed for wheelchair accessibility. Even their personal space reflected their commitment to proving that adaptation created opportunity rather than limitation. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he hadn't left?" Marcus asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I'd be miserable. Probably divorced by now, definitely bitter about all the adventures I never experienced. David would have spent our marriage resenting me for needing accommodations he considered inconveniences." The honesty surprised neither of them. Their relationship had been built on direct communication about difficult truths, a foundation that allowed them to discuss past relationships without jealousy or defensiveness. "Jenny says the local gossip mill is having a field day with the engagement," Sarah continued. "Apparently, David's been telling people that our relationship ended by mutual agreement when we realized we wanted different things." Marcus's expression darkened slightly, rewriting history to make himself look better. Let him. The people who matter know what really happened, and the people who don't matter will believe whatever. Version makes them feel superior. Sarah had learned to distinguish between opinions worth considering and social noise that served no purpose beyond entertainment. David's revisionist narrative didn't diminish her happiness or change the reality of what their relationship had actually been. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez, her former neurologist, asking if she'd be willing to speak at the next spinal injury support group meeting. The request came monthly now. Medical professionals had recognized that Sarah's combination of clinical knowledge and personal experience made her uniquely effective at helping newly injured patients navigate their initial despair. Speaking. "Engagement tonight?" Marcus asked, noting her smile as she read the message. "Dr. Martinez wants me to talk with a college student who was injured in a skiing accident last month. 20 years old, complete T10 injury, convinced his life is over." Marcus nodded with understanding. They'd both learned that recent trauma created tunnel vision that made recovery seem impossible until someone demonstrated alternative possibilities. Sarah's presence in her custom wheelchair, wearing professional clothing and radiating confidence. Often accomplished more than months of traditional counseling. I'll tell him about Colorado mountain passes, accessible by motorcycle, Sarah said, already planning her approach. Show him pictures from our camping trip to Yellowstone last summer. The photographs from their adventure travels had become powerful tools in Sarah's advocacy work. Images of her navigating hiking trails in her off-road wheelchair, camping in adaptive equipment, riding behind Marcus through scenic mountain passes, each. Picture challenged assumptions about what disabled people could accomplish with proper support and creative problem-solving. David's wedding announcement went into the recycling bin without ceremony, joining other irrelevant communications that briefly entered their lives before disappearing into forgotten history. Sarah had more important concerns than her former fiancé's social climbing and carefully curated image of success. Tonight she would help a frightened young man understand that spinal cord injury represented a new chapter rather than an ending. That adaptation opened different doors rather than closing all possibilities. Sarah's gratitude journal sat open on her nightstand, filled with daily entries documenting the unexpected blessings that had emerged from her darkest moment. Each page reflected appreciation for the path her life had taken, proof that devastation could become foundation for something better than she'd ever imagined possible. Tonight's entry would commemorate the second anniversary of her abandoned wedding, a date that now marked celebration rather than sorrow. The entries painted a portrait of transformation over 24 months. Early pages showed tentative gratitude for small victories. Marcus's friendship, Jenny's unwavering support, the first successful client at their advocacy organization. Recent entries overflowed with appreciation for a life rich with purpose, love, and adventure that exceeded every dream she dared to form before her accident. Marcus found her writing by lamplight, her wheelchair positioned beside their bed, as she completed the evening ritual that had become essential to her emotional health. The journal represented more than documentation. It was daily practice in recognizing abundance rather than focusing on limitation. "What are you grateful for tonight?" Marcus asked, settling onto the bed beside her chair. "Everything," Sarah replied simply. "But especially the moment you walked into that church 2 years ago." They'd returned to Montana for the anniversary, not to revisit trauma, but to speak at the Veterans Hospital about their advocacy programs. The trip had provided unexpected closure, allowing Sarah to see how completely her life had changed since that humiliating morning at the altar. Pastor Williams had approached them after their presentation, his weathered face bright with genuine joy at seeing Sarah's transformation. The man who'd struggled to manage her wedding crisis now praised her professional accomplishments and obvious happiness with Marcus. "I always believed everything happens for a reason," Pastor Williams had said. "But seeing you now, I understand that sometimes the worst moments create space for the best possibilities." Mrs. Henderson had attended their presentation too, bringing her autistic grandson whose challenges had taught her about judgment and acceptance. The woman who'd recorded Sarah's humiliation on her phone now volunteered with their organization, helping military families navigate disability services with the passion of someone who'd learned hard lessons about compassion. Even Tank, the Hells Angels president, had been moved by their return to Montana, seeing the place where their love story began, understanding the courage it had taken for both Sarah and Marcus to trust each other despite their respective wounds, had deepened his respect for their partnership. "You two make the rest of us believe in fairy tales," Tank had said during their visit to the Motorcycle Club's Montana chapter. "Not the Disney kind, but the real ones where people earn their happy endings through grit and determination." Sarah closed her journal and transferred to the bed, her movements automatic after 2 years of shared space with Marcus. Physical intimacy had been another area where she'd needed to unlearn David's careful distance and embrace Marcus's acceptance of her complete self, disability included. "Do you ever think about the other timeline?" Sarah asked. "The one where David didn't run, where I married him and spent the next 40 years trying to be smaller than I actually am? Marcus considered the question seriously. Sometimes, usually when I'm helping a veteran whose family couldn't handle their injuries. Makes me realize how lucky we got, finding each other when we both needed saving. Through their bedroom window, the lights of Denver spread below them like earthbound stars. Their home sat in the foothills, where mountain air carried promises of adventure and possibility. Tomorrow, they would break ground on the Veterans Transition Facility, beginning construction of a dream that would serve military families for generations. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the young man she'd spoken with at the spinal injury support group. His message was brief but powerful. Signed up for adaptive skiing lessons. Thank you for showing me what's possible. Each success story validated their decision to dedicate their lives to advocacy work. Robert Patterson now mentored newly injured veterans. The Henderson family had become fierce advocates for autism awareness. Dr. Martinez regularly referred patients to their programs, knowing that peer support often accomplished what medical intervention couldn't achieve. "I have something for you," Marcus said, producing a small wrapped package from his nightstand drawer. Inside was a silver charm bracelet with a single pendant, a tiny motorcycle with movable wheels. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly custom-made by someone who understood the significance of the gift. "For our adventures," Marcus explained. "Past and future." Sarah fastened the bracelet around her wrist, the motorcycle charm catching lamplight as it settled beside her medical alert bracelet. The contrast struck her as perfect. One piece of jewelry marking limitation, the other celebrating possibility. 2 years ago, she'd been abandoned at an altar, convinced her life was ending. Tonight, she fell asleep beside the man who'd shown her that sometimes the best chapters begin when the worst ones finally close.